button because you know I forget those things. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Beyond Access series session. Tonight, we're here for part two of social emotional learning with Dr. David Schonfeld, who is the director for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. Uh, Tonight, as in every night, you have the opportunity to ask questions and through the Q&A function. We will be monitoring that function and sharing with you and answering questions at the end. If you have questions specific to your child's IEP, you can absolutely email those questions to specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov. Or if you're going to put it in the Q&A, make sure you ask the question with either a phone number or an email address that we can share with our colleagues to get back to you. Um, I think those are all the announcements. So without any further ado, Dr. Schoenfeld, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much. So what we're going to be talking about today is really just helping children cope with distress during the pandemic. Um, During our previous session, which was on January 26th, we talked about how children come to understand illness and how to discuss COVID-19 with them, how to explain it to them. So this session is going to go beyond that and really talk about how do you then help them deal with the distress. So it's going to be much more practically oriented about different techniques and strategies that you can use. Now, during this presentation, I'm going to review some of the common adjustment reactions you may see in children during the pandemic, and then I'm going to share with you some suggestions for supporting children during this time, as well as strategies you can share for dealing with the distress. And I also want to stress the need to remember to take care of yourself and to set reasonable expectations for your children and yourself, and I'll come back and talk about that. So I'm going to start by outlining some of the common reactions that you can see in any crisis situation, and including this pandemic, that may be seen among children. And I want to say you'll see these same reactions among adults as well. So you may notice that in adults that you interact with, as well as perhaps even in yourself. But I do want to say from the very beginning that the most common reaction is actually not on the slide, and that's nothing. Children tend to often hide their distress. They're often reluctant to share their reactions. They may worry that they're abnormal or inappropriate, or they don't want to burden others who are upset, including their parents and other caregivers. So adults actually tend to underestimate children's reactions, especially related to how they feel. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about the unique challenges of children with neurodevelopmental, behavioral, emotional, and intellectual disabilities, because those children may actually have difficulty expressing those needs, particularly verbally. So I'll come back to the unique challenges of children who have those needs. But let me start out just generally at the types of reactions you may see. So the first is fears, and those can be fears related to the pandemic, such as being afraid of becoming infected or ill, and those would be common and expected. But you may also see anxiety, and anxiety would include fears that aren't specifically related to the crisis, just as becoming more fearful of the dark. So you may see, for example, some developmental fears and worries that children have because they're fearful. And that's the anxiety, is it isn't specific fears, it's more generalized fear. You can also see school avoidance after any crisis event. Children may be reluctant to separate from their family because they're afraid that something may happen if their parents and other caregivers aren't there to protect them. Or sometimes children are also worried that something will happen to their family if they aren't there in some way to look out for them or to help them themselves. Now, after sheltering at home for a long period of time, when kids do return to school physically, we should expect many of them are going to be afraid to go into public spaces such as schools when the virus is still spreading. And many parents are obviously going to be reluctant to send their kids in that setting. And that's going to be the situation, because the virus is still going to be spreading at some level or still be out in the community when we do expect kids to return to classrooms. Now, what you want to do with children is find out their individual fears or concerns. As I talked about last session, children's fears and concerns may actually be very different than those of adults. And you really can't reassure children, or for that matter, even adults, if you don't know what they're actually afraid of or concerned about. Otherwise, you usually aren't offering reassurance, but rather you're just telling them why you aren't worried. And when two people each talk only from their own perspective, we call that arguing. And I think all of you know that arguing is not very effective in providing reassurance to someone. So you need to find out first, what are they worried or concerned about? And that's why I spent so much time on the last session talking about how kids think about this. We also want to be sure that we don't tell children that they shouldn't be worried or even try and minimize their concerns. Instead, we should help them learn how to deal with their uncertainty and their fear and other distressing feelings that they might have, rather than either pretend that they don't or shouldn't exist in the middle of a pandemic. We should also avoid using fear-based approaches to encourage kids and adults to take steps to prevent illness. People need to feel some degree of risk in order to take steps to keep safe, but excessive fear is actually overwhelming, and it may actually even lead to more risky behavior. So it can lead to what we call a sense of fatalism. Just that's when people just give up trying to be safer. Kids may conclude that these germs are everywhere and everyone you have to imagine has it. So eventually you're just going to get it anyway. And so why should you take any or even try to take any steps, particularly for something that's lasted this long? I'm sure that a lot of people are just feeling like it's hopeless to try and prevent getting infected. So you might as well just go ahead and get sick and get it over with, which is not a good approach. They may also reach a conclusion that one or more risks have just been exaggerated. And that may make children conclude that actually all risks from the same source are either false or they're exaggerated. So they might say, for example, I went to school one day and someone at school had COVID and I didn't wash my hands that day in school and I actually didn't come down with it. So I think everyone's just exaggerating how bad this is. And therefore, I'm just not going to believe any of this. It's the same way when people say, oh, I know someone who had it and they got over it. And everyone talks about the fact that, it's so serious, but it really wasn't that bad. So what we need to do is help children understand that risks are what we call relative, not absolute. There are steps that we can take that are reasonable that'll decrease the risk of our getting the illness or getting sick from being exposed. And it's worth the effort to do that, even though we can't eliminate all the risk. What you may actually see in some kids, particularly older kids, is that they may intentionally take a risk just to prove they can survive anyway. If kids are so scared, or adults, they may decide that they're just overwhelmed with fear, and then what they need to do is confront that fear. That's probably one of the reasons why adolescents experiment with risky behaviors like drugs. It's not that they believe themselves not to be vulnerable, but it's that they don't want to be vulnerable. They're so concerned that they have to try something and then be able to say, look, it's not that big a deal. We were hearing things about young adults and adolescents taking part in what they called COVID-19 parties, where they were exposing themselves on purpose to someone who was infected and betting on who was going to catch it first. They obviously knew you could catch it, otherwise there wouldn't be anything to bet on. It's not that they didn't think it was a risk. For some of those people, it's probably because they were really scared of getting infected and they wanted to prove they could actually be near people again and not get it. So I just am making a point that we have to be careful about trying to frighten children to do things, because that fear can actually backfire and cause more problems. If you go back to the list of problems and go down to the next one, you can have sleep problems. That can be trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, difficulty waking in the morning, nightmares, or really any change in sleep. You can also see change in appetite or eating. And when kids don't sleep well, they don't do anything well. Same with adults. So it's hard for them to learn if they haven't slept well. It's hard for them to keep their emotions in check, and so sleep becomes very important. So we want to make sure that we're managing sleep as much as possible. That is not to say that they need medication for sleep, but rather that you need to make sure that you're giving them the best opportunity to fall asleep and get a good night's sleep. And I can answer questions based on what type of sleep problems your children are having about how you might handle that. Now, I do want to say from the very beginning that all the reactions that I'm going to go over on this list are not specific to the pandemic. And often it's just difficult to figure out what exactly is the cause. So, as an example, difficulty sleeping is one of the most common reactions to many different types of crisis events. And it can also be due to a lot of other reasons. It's not even due to the crisis. For example, one of the complaints that or concerns that I'm hearing a lot is my adolescent stays up really late at night, spends a lot of time chatting with friends or is online, and then they go to sleep late, they have trouble waking in the morning, they're not on time for their online classes, they're not finishing their homework. How do I know whether this is because my child has trauma, because my child is depressed, because my child is an adolescent, and that's just what adolescents do? See, there's lots of different reasons why kids would do this. So one of the reasons I'm going over this is we don't always know what the cause is, but we don't have to figure it out 100% before we can try and manage the problem. So if you think about it, for many adolescents, particularly if they're stuck at home with their parents for close to a year, it can feel very much like you're trapped at home. And so what some adolescents will do is they'll stay up later because that way, after their parents go to sleep or other caregivers in the house, they have some time when they're relatively alone. And it might be a time when they can watch TV and not feel like the adults in the family are watching them watch TV. They can be online, they can chat, they can text, and they can feel like they're relatively alone. And then they sleep in the next morning when their parents are awake. In a way, it's a way to be socially distanced when you can't physically distance. So in some ways, it can make sense for the kid. But if they're tired the next day, they're not able to get up for their online classes, and they can't finish their homework, it's not working. So I always tell parents, don't try and figure out whether them staying up late at night is normal or abnormal. Just figure out if it's causing problems. And then you just have to say to the kid, well, it's not working. So let's figure out what will work. So instead of saying you're supposed to be in bed earlier, it's not normal to stay up till 2 a.m, because then they'll just say all the kids are doing that. And that may very well be the case. So the issue is not working in your schedule, or you're not feeling rested enough to do a good job with your work the next day. So let's figure out how that can be adjusted. So the next one on this slide is difficulty with concentration and difficulty and problems with academic performance problems. So you can find if kids aren't sleeping, they'll have trouble concentrating and they won't do their work as well. But there's other reasons why they may not do their work as well or have trouble concentrating. It could be that they're anxious or upset or worried. You can also see sadness and depression, and I'm happy to talk with people about how do you figure out what's just a kid who's feeling sad because something sad has happened. They hear about deaths that have occurred, they hear about other problems related to the pandemic, and that makes them feel sad, which is very understandable. Or has it gone beyond that and is something you have to be more worried about? You can also see anger or irritability. In people who are angry and are under a lot of stress are often less tolerant of change. They look for predictability and they have a lot of trouble with unpredictability. And they also have trouble with stress or any additional stress. And unfortunately in this pandemic, we see all of that. And of course, there are some children, for example, children with autism spectrum disorder, who already are not as tolerant to change and unpredictability. So you'll find that the stress of the pandemic can cause problems in that area. And then for people who are highly stressed, they may also have distrust and suspiciousness. And those kind of reactions can cause problems in relationships among family members, among adults who work together, as well as among friends. And it makes it hard for them to form new relationships. You can also see an increase in or a new onset of problems with alcohol and other substance use, tobacco and other drug use. And then you can see physical symptoms such as headache or stomach ache. So we see a lot of different fatigue and pain can come from stress. And the problem is, it can be from multiple different things. So you can imagine if you have a child who's, feeling short of breath, they're breathing quickly and feel like they can't catch their breath. You're trying to figure out, is that a panic attack from stress? Or are they having an asthma attack if they already have asthma? Because stress hormones can worsen asthma. Or are they infected with COVID? So you can see it can be all three of those, and that can make it complicated. So when you're unsure, that's when you call on healthcare providers, your pediatrician or other child healthcare provider, to help you sort out which one of those is going on. You can see grief, and that's going to be what we talk about next session. How do you deal with grief that you see in children during this pandemic? And then the last one on this slide is guilt. People, and children included, somehow manage to find reasons to feel guilty, no matter what their experience or role is in the event. At some level, even if it's only unconscious, it may seem easier to feel responsible for something you did, didn't do, or should have done to prevent someone you care about from becoming infected, ill, or having a bad outcome from the illness, rather than just to accept it might have nothing to do with you. Because if it had nothing to do with you, that means it could happen to someone else you care about, and there may be nothing you can actually do to prevent that. So there's what we call this illusion of control. If you accept responsibility, then that may make you believe that you can actually control it so it doesn't happen again. And that may make you feel reassured at first, but it actually doesn't help others from prevent others from getting ill. And it leaves the child or the adult feeling guilt that makes it hard for them to adjust to the situation. So children who experience the death of a family member during the pandemic may question how they may have by mistake exposed a family member to the virus, or wondered if there was some way they should have picked up on symptoms before the illness became more serious, or just wondered what they ought to have done to get help earlier on in the illness. And that's one of the big problems with all of these messages around fear. We've been telling kids and young adults, you know, I've heard this a number of times, you may realize that it's less likely that you will get sick or die from this virus. But if you go out and get infected, you may spread it without knowing it to an older relative that you care about, and they may die as a result. Well, then when someone does die that they do know, I think they're very likely to feel quite a lot of guilt, and they're probably going to have no idea whether or not they were the cause of the infection, because it's often without symptoms. And so we have to be cautious again about these messages that bring in a lot of fear. Now, all of these reactions may be due to the pandemic itself, but they may also be due to a wide range of other stresses associated with the pandemic. For example, if there's a financial impact of unemployment or partial employment and other stressors during the pandemic, that may increase tension among the adults in the household. And that can lead to worse anxiety among parents. Parent may find they're more depressed or have other problems with mental illness, or they may start using alcohol or other drugs more. And it may even lead to more violence within the family. So during the pandemic, I suggest people don't just look for children who've had a family member who became ill or die, but rather we have to ask more generally how they're doing. Because it may not be just the virus that's causing the problem directly. It may be a lot of the things that followed from the pandemic. Now, during this time, we should all watch what I call our media consumption. Make sure you have a healthy diet and you don't consume too much. Adults should try to keep informed through focused but just periodic attention to a media source that you trust. Don't listen to, watch, or read continual coverage, even though I know it is available. The pandemic is going to be here for a very long time. It's already been here for a long time, and it's going to continue. And so you're just going to get overwhelmed and exhausted if you try and keep up with all the information. So I think it's useful to remind yourself and to tell your children there really are two main reasons to listen to, watch, or read media coverage during a crisis. One's to be reassured, and the other is to learn practical steps to keep yourself or those you care about safe. So if you're watching the television or looking online at news And you realize you're not getting more reassured. Most of the information is not very reassuring. And if you're not learning new practical information about steps to take, that are relevant to you, for example, you already know about wearing a mask, you already know to stay a distance away and to keep outside. If you've already got all of that down, then you're not, the media that you're exposing yourself to is just upsetting you, and it's not a benefit. And that's a time to just disconnect from media, whether that's television, radio, print, or social media, at least for a period of time. And we should be advising children of that as well, but also explain why. This is actually a good time for everyone to just unplug and connect instead with family and friends in person if they live with you, and remotely if they don't. Now, children, as I said, with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities may have some unique challenges after a crisis event. Children who can't communicate well verbally, like what they can tell you, often express their distress in what we call nonverbal ways. They may become more aggressive or have more disruptive behavior. They can show more changes in their sleep, eating, or toileting patterns. Some children may increase self stimulating behaviors, particularly kids with autism spectrum disorder or more marked intellectual disabilities. They may rock, chew on their clothes or fingers, or become even more intolerant of changes in their routine. I remember talking to about one family. This was a child who had autism spectrum disorder and was not verbal. So he wasn't able to explain how he felt. One of his parents died, and then sometime after that, he started banging his head more. And people wondered what was bothering him. And so they, checked for an ear infection, a sore throat, a sinus infection, and they couldn't figure out what it was. So they admitted him into the hospital. And it wasn't until he was in the hospital for a couple of days that someone noticed that the head banging increased every time someone talked about his parent that had died. He was really just doing that for self-soothing. And actually putting him in the hospital was probably just made that worse because now he was separated from all of his family members and in a strange environment. So, what you want to do with children who have autism spectrum disorder and other types of disabilities is make sure that you reestablish routines quickly after a crisis has occurred. Ideally, you would go back to the usual routine, but we can't do that in the pandemic. So, you just need to come up with new routines and make sure you stick with them. In some situations, there may be a death of a caregiver, for example, or they have to move to a new home or school setting. And then again, what you have to do is, as soon as possible, try and establish new and consistent routines so that they have more of a sense of a predictability. Now, as I tell people, I can't tell you when kids are going to be able to go back to school without wearing a mask, but you can tell them when you're going to have dinner. So try and figure out what that routine is that you can ensure, that you can make happen each day, and let them know about it. And of course, give them as much notice as possible if you're going to have to make some change to that. We also shouldn't pretend that everything's okay when obviously it is not. Children pick up when parents and other adults are not being genuine and honest, and they're going to be less likely to ask questions or ask advice when they feel that's the case. Children actually benefit from knowing that caregivers and important adults in their lives, such as their classroom teachers, have similar or additional concerns, and so that they can learn how adults deal effectively with troubling or distressing feelings. We really can't expect children to share all their concerns when we're unwilling to even admit we have concerns ourselves. And we can't help them learn how to cope with distress if we don't model effective coping techniques. But this doesn't mean that adults should share all of their concerns. Some concerns are really primarily those of adults, such as related to how the pandemic may, change employment or income of parents and other members of the family. Parents should try and discuss those concerns privately when children are not likely to overhear the discussion. If children do pick up on financial concerns, then if possible, share honest, reassuring information that helps them figure out the financial concerns in the context that's relevant to the child. For example, if you were planning on buying a new car and you no longer can afford it, you can say, with all that's going on, it's no longer a good time for us to buy a new car. But don't worry, we have enough money saved that we're going to be able to meet our living expenses. See, if children just find out that we don't have enough money, They may worry there's not enough money for food or even to pay for where they're living. Now, in some families, financial concerns were a big issue prior to the pandemic, and they actually are worse now for many. So, in discussions with children, try to focus on what you honestly can provide for, rather than on what you may not be able to pay for if the situation worsens. So, I'm not saying be dishonest or misleading to children, but try and help explain what you know you can do. Be sure to include positive or reassuring information and present a hopeful perspective overall. If children are very worried or upset, then it's not a good time to discuss in detail or repeatedly your strong criticism of the government's response to date or the leadership of those in office. Try instead to communicate that you hope and you expect that scientists and public health officials are learning how best to handle the situation, and that overall you anticipate your community, New York City, state of New York, and the country will make decisions to address the pandemic effectively. It doesn't mean you have to agree with all the decisions, but you do need to share with them your optimism that we will be able to take care of this. Then explore with children different strategies of dealing with their distress, discomfort, anxiety, and sadness. And this might include reading or hobbies for healthy distraction, talking to others, journaling, blogging, art, and music to express feelings. We have to do both. Sometimes we need to step aside from what's upsetting us and allow ourselves to be distracted so that we can feel we're recovering and coping. And then at other times, we have to turn and face what's bothering us, talk about it, and try and deal with it. The problem is both are good coping strategies, but people don't do them at the same time. So you may find, for example, let's say there's two adults in a family and they're in the middle of a crisis. There may be one that wants to talk about it, and at the same time, maybe their partner wants to go out jogging and just use distraction and exercise. And you can imagine the other person would say, the person that I'm married to or is my partner is running away from me, because that's what it feels like. So what you need to do is discuss the fact that you have different legitimate coping strategies. So it may be before the person goes out running, they can say, I'd like to go running and clear my mind, but you said you wanted to talk. Do you want to do that first, or can we do it when I get back from my run? So you just need to figure out how to meet in the middle from time to time and recognize people may have different strategies and approaches that are also appropriate. Some people also use exercise or yoga. Respectful humor can be used as well, and relaxation techniques and mindfulness. And those can be used even with young children. We should also help children identify appropriate steps they can take to personally protect their own health as well as to help others. They do need to learn self-care, so they need to take responsibility to the extent they can, depends on the level of disability of the child, but to do what they can to protect themselves. For young children, let them provide some of their input into how they're going to wash their hands and what they're going to do to make sure that they're washing it properly and long enough. Now, I don't want to be critical, and I don't know who recommended this, but if you're home during the pandemic and you're not able to celebrate your birthday with friends and family the way you usually would because of the pandemic, probably the last thing you want to sing over and over when you wash your hands is happy birthday. So let kids pick what they want to do. They just have to figure out what's going to be a good way that they make sure they wash their hands properly and long enough. Older children and children who have more skills should be able to figure out some ways with you that they can help others, like drop off food outside the door of elderly neighbors, or maybe just make phone calls periodically to just keep in touch with relatives that are older and are feeling isolated. If kids feel they're doing something to help others during this pandemic, they're less likely to feel helpless. And finding ways to help others can also help children feel like they're doing something of value at a time when many of us are just feeling very powerless. But you also need to remember to take care of yourself. All adults likely have concerns about their own health, as well as those of family member and friends. And please do what you can to take care of those needs. Don't just focus on the needs of your children. When children are highly stressed, they tend to what we call regress. They act less mature, they become more demanding or selfish, or they may just have more difficulty getting along with their friends and family members. Some children may actually appear disinterested just because they're overwhelmed with their concerns. And they may need to focus first on their own needs. What does this mean for their plans for after high school? What does it mean for their vacation, their hobbies, their sports, their friendships? And they may need to think about that before they're ready to think of the needs of others. And this is often a sign that they're under stress and having difficulty coping, not that they just don't care about other people. So you can imagine that you have, let's say, a high school student who says, it's not fair. I'm not allowed to go out and play soccer with my friends. That's just stupid because, they just had they said the Super Bowl and they could play football. In soccer, you don't even touch the ball. You can stay 6 feet apart. It's outdoors. There's no good reason why we can't do this. People don't understand how difficult this is for me. It's unfair. You can imagine that conversation keeps going. And eventually, an adult caregiver just says, you know what? There are people who had family members that died. You should be grateful that all you can't do is play soccer. Well, to be quite honest, if someone else dies, it doesn't make you feel any better that you can't play soccer. But what it does do is make you feel guilty that you mentioned it. And so it doesn't help kids cope with what they've lost or what they can no longer do for this time period, but it will make them feel guilty. And then they're going to be less likely to talk to you about things that worry them or upset them. Now, the reason why adults will do this is because they get overwhelmed and frustrated as well. And I hear a lot of people saying, crisis brings out the best in people. I've done this work for over 3 decades. It tends to bring out their stress. And to be quite honest, people usually aren't their best in crisis. Yes, there are some acts of, helping others and stepping up and doing great things. But most of the time, people are just not at their best. And being around kids and other adults who are needy and demanding and self-centered and distressed, it wears on people. And it isn't particularly satisfying. So please be patient with your children, the other adults in your life, and above all, be patient with yourself. And that's what I wanted to end with. You're most likely to feel overwhelmed if you feel you're either unable or unprepared to provide support to your children. But remember, there is a lot we can do, even in the midst of this changing pandemic. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing of value. You know your children best, and you've identified strategies already that have helped in the past to decrease your children's distress, and you can try some of them now. And I'm just finishing up, but I'm going to ask you put in the chat box now some of the strategies that you've used to be able to help your children when they're in distress. And then we're going to share some of them as a group. Now, when children with disabilities are highly stressed, it may actually require more tolerance on your part for some of those self-calming behaviors that I mentioned that you generally try and decrease, such as watching television or using an iPad. And that's relaxing for some kids, particularly kids with autism spectrum disorder, for example. Or there may be other ways that they rock or chew on things that don't hurt them, but you want them to do less of that normally. And when people are really stressed, sometimes they have to do the things which they did when they were less mature. And so we might allow them to watch a little bit more of screen time or allow them to rock a little bit more. We don't want to have them do anything that harms themselves. So if they bite themselves in a way that harms themselves, then no, we do have to figure out how to stop that. But some of that less mature behavior we may have to accept in the middle of a pandemic. You may not feel that what you can offer is enough. Children may want, and they may even need more than you can provide at times. And in that case, contact your pediatrician or other pediatric healthcare provider by phone or email for advice, and reach out to resources in your school and your school district and elsewhere in the community when you feel more is needed. But do try and recognize and celebrate the positive contributions you can and you do make to support your children. That might be the moments that you help your child smile, even if it's just for a moment, or you help them learn something so they feel a sense of accomplishment during a time they might otherwise just feel overwhelmed. And try and set reasonable expectations. Kids are just not going to learn as much schoolwork during this time period as they would have had we been able to keep schools in session and if we weren't in a crisis. So don't try and keep the same pace of learning, or you're just going to overwhelm children and yourself. And I'm going to warn you now that when schools do resume completely in person, and when we are no longer worried about the spread of this virus, we're not going to be able to catch up and have kids learn everything they missed during this long time period. We have to recognize at some level the world has changed, so the curriculum has also changed. And if we're teaching children how to cope with distress and adjust to a crisis, we're actually helping them learn life skills that make them more resilient in the future and more capable of dealing with future problems in their lives. And in the end, those lessons are really the most important ones. So try and recognize the way your children are learning during this pandemic. Let your children's teachers know what they're doing that's working and helpful to your children during these challenging times. Find opportunities to do something enjoyable with your children, and let them share with you and show you what's important to them that maybe you didn't have time to share together before. And be sure to recognize what you're doing to help children cope with this crisis. So before I open this to questions, I just wanted to share this last slide, which talks about what we're going to talk about in the remaining 3 sessions that we have. The next one is going to be on explaining death to children, why we should have that conversation, and what they need to understand in order to cope with loss. Then I'll talk about, in the session afterwards, coping strategies for families of children with special needs. That's something that's even more of a need now. And then we'll end by talking more about taking care of yourself during this current pandemic. So at this point, I'm going to just review some of the key takeaways. That children may show a range of reactions to a crisis, but many reactions are going to be hidden, especially when children have trouble communicating it verbally. You need to identify children's unique fears or concerns before you can give them reassurance that will be effective. You should avoid fear as a way to motivate behavior. And remember to take care of yourself and recognize and celebrate the positive contributions you make every day, because I know that there are many contributions that you make to help support your children. This has just more details on the next session. At this point, I'm going to stop here and turn this over to questions. And I hope we can also share some of the coping strategies that you've used so you can share them with other parents as well. And I'm seeing at this point questions. So I'll remind people, try and put some things in here that you've used as coping, and then I can also answer the questions while you're entering that information.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in here. And so we can, well, as folks type in, I think there's one. So, and I think you talked about this a little bit, right? How can I minimize my child's screen time without him feeling like I'm punishing him?
Right. Well, I think we have to remind ourselves that the main reason that pediatricians, for example, recommend decreasing screen time in general with children is because it doesn't provide them as much opportunity to do other things. So if they're watching television, they're not out exploring nature. They're not out interacting with friends. They're not out playing sports. Well, the problem is they're not able to do a lot of those things now. So part of the reason we minimize screen time is because we want them. Oh, and I see that the chat function's disabled. So thank you for pointing that out. So you can, and maybe Jose, you can tell us what they should.
Yeah, feel free to drop your thoughts into the Q&A as well. So don't please use the Q&A to drop in those things as well.
Yeah. So again, we minimize the amount of screen time because we wanted to encourage other types of social interactions and other activities. But if you're working from home and you're occupied a lot of the time, and you need to then make dinner, and so sometimes you just have to allow kids to use more screen time. Now, hopefully, what you will do is you will encourage them to find other types of activities on screens. So it might be that they're doing some learning activities on screens, or maybe there are learning games that they can play on their iPad. And so you can talk with people in the school about what are some other things that your kids can do to stay safely occupied, that are enjoyable to them. And that's some of what we have to do. But if you're just, this isn't a time for them to become extremely independent when they can't leave the house. Um, so again, we want to make sure they're not doing things that are unsafe or hurtful, but we may have to allow them to do a little bit more self-soothing. I'm, for example, watching a little bit more TV, not a lot, still don't have time, but I do try and sit down and watch TV because that's one of the things that I can do socially. And so I didn't do that before because there were other things that I could do, but now I have less access to them. And I see here that someone had said that their son has no desire to go outside anymore. So part of it is we have to be careful that we aren't making kids so afraid that they're not going outside at all. And so everyone's situation is different. If you live in an apartment building and an area which is very dense and it's hard to find a place where you can go and keep physically distanced from people, and I understand it's very cold there. And so, if it's cold and it's not comfortable being outside, and you really can't find a place to be outside that's safe in terms of physical distancing, then I understand people might be afraid to go outside or not want to be outside. So try and figure out if it gets warm enough, or you have a day where the weather's a little better, and you can go run outside, and there's a place that you can go where it's open, and you can keep a physical distance. Then maybe what you do is you say, well, normally we do homework until 4:30, but if we do that, one time when we could go outside when it's nice weather, we'd miss it. So let's go run outside and do something for 30 minutes and then we'll come back.
That's
So
great. I'm seeing another question in here from someone saying that their son shows behaviors like clenching teeth, and they have chewy tubes and Z vibe, but the clenching is still happening. Do you have any suggestions?
yeah, and so part of this is going to be highly dependent on why your child chews. And so this is something that you may talk over with, for example, your ABA specialist, if you have an AB applied behavioral analysis therapist, or talk over with your occupational therapist if they're the ones that wrote for the chewy tubes and the Z vibe, or your pediatrician. So if they're doing it because they're anxious, then try and make them feel less anxious. If they're doing it because they're overtired, then make sure you're getting good sleep patterns in place. If they're doing it because they're bored, figure out ways that you might be able to keep them occupied. Um, and so again, I think it depends on why they're doing it. But of course, if they're clenching their teeth, then that causes discomfort. So you do want to try and substitute more the the chewies, I guess that's what I've heard it called a lot, or things that they can chew on. But you
Hmm.
also have to look at to why they're chewing and what seems to cause the chewing to occur more. And that's why individuals like who do ABA, they often can figure out what is causing certain behaviors and try and help decrease those behaviors.
I'm seeing some coping strategies starting to come in. We have one that says spontaneous dance parties, playing board games, and talking about whatever. My son is 13, so sometimes we just talk about the importance of being positive.
Great. These are all good ideas. And, some of what you can do is you might be able to, you know, spend some time with your child teaching them certain life skills. Like if you've got to cook dinner and your child is able to, at least in most children, even with significant disabilities, can help in some way, you can engage them in that so that they learn a little bit more about preparing a meal or setting a table or cleaning up. They can do the laundry with you. You figure out different ways that they can help do things together. That actually can help with their life skills that will be important. I think that's relevant for children, even children without any type of disability. Um, I wish I had learned how to cook a little bit more when I was younger. I know that was a problem when I went out on my own, and it wasn't a good time to learn it then. So
Here's
you,
another good one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, please.
Oh, here's another good one. It says, I've tried to make my son's schedule resemble like it was before pandemic. All services and therapies around same time frame. Some resemblance of the schedule does help with structure.
Yes. So the degree to which you can reestablish the same structure, that's great. Now, I do want to say that often what I hear is people say, kids just should go back to school and do things exactly the way they did before. They need structure. The problem is they need structure with supports. So when kids do go back to school, they're not they're not going to be able to learn at the same rate, and they will need more support and maybe some more breaks and some more time to, you know, do self-calming behavior or mindfulness, etc. So but when you're home, if you can keep the schedule to similar to what it was before, that's great. It makes it easier with the transition. If you can, let's say that certain of the therapies and services are only available at a time that's different than what it was available when the child was at school, then I think what you do is you transition to the new schedule, and then you just try and keep the new schedule, make that the new routine. So it's really more the predictability. If if it's if it's different initially, they won't be able to predict it, and that causes distress. But once there's consistency and predictability, they will adjust to that new schedule. It's the same way you do everything at the same hour, but then daylight savings happens and everything shifts an hour,
Mhm.
and you get used to that, and then you don't notice the difference. So it's really the predictability. So for kids who uh, can't tell time, then you can do pictured schedules. You can show pictures of this is what we do now and this is what we do next. They do that in school for kids with disabilities. They actually have bells in school, alarms that go off that tell you when to go to the next class. So there are different what we call cues to let you know when things are changing, and they do that in school. Find out what your teachers have done in school and try and do some of that at home as well.
That's a great suggestion, and I'm going to drop into the chat for all of you a link to one of the resources we have on the DOE website. And we've shared it here in the Beyond Access series before, but it's the guidance on promoting positive behavior at home, which gives you all resources and information on how to create graphic organizers, schedules, all of those things at home that Dr. Schoenfeld just talked about. There's another question here, Dr. Schoenfeld. Do you have any thoughts or ideas of how to support and help parents with more than one child who is experiencing regression in their social emotional learning skills?
Yeah. So this is where I get back to, please recognize that you've got a lot on your plate. And so if you have multiple children and those children have different needs and they're under stress, and you're trying also to do a job at the same time, like if you're working from home, or even if you don't have a job outside the home, let's be honest, you're watching your kids for longer number of hours, and you still have other responsibilities, whether that's getting food to be able to prepare meals. Well, if you have children that have a lot of needs, it may be hard for you to get to the grocery store and still watch your kids. So first off, set expectations for yourself that are reasonable. Pick the things that are the most problematic, the ones that might hurt your child or are causing a lot of distress, and work on those. And I tell people, like, sometimes you don't need to set the table the same way. You use paper plates if it's just too much work all the time to clean up after big meals. Keep things simpler. Um, Maybe you keep your house neat, but not as neat as it was before. So maybe it's just clean, but you're not trying to make sure that everything is put where it used to be, because that might take up too much of your time. So if you try and just do everything the way you did before and add in watching your children for another 8 hours, it doesn't work. There are still only 24 hours in the day. You can't make the days longer. And I will tell you, if you try and make up for it by skipping sleep, which was the only time when you didn't have responsibility for your kids, then that doesn't even work on the short term. You'll just get exhausted and overwhelmed. So some of it is just pick the things that are most important and work on those. And don't worry as much about some of the other things. And this is something to talk over with your child's educators, particularly if they're in special education, the supports that you have related to your special education services, and your pediatrician. Can you help me out with this? So I saw something on what do I do if my kid's wetting their bed? So you ask, can you help me with that? Because I think for each of these things, they're important to work on if it's really causing distress to you or your child, but it's hard to do while you're taking care of everything else.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schoenfeld. I want to finish up here with a couple of other coping strategies and positive things that folks have jumped in here. Someone wrote cooking together, artwork, having a cozy corner with favorite things where they can where a child can relax, and then an interesting suggestion is tasks that are completed virtually together, not face to face. So interesting things there. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, and so there are kids actually have learned and they've grown up making friendships and maintaining friendships and relationships remotely. I mean, they use social media. They used social media before there was the pandemic. So they're actually better at it. Now, I know all the time we kept saying, yeah, but in person is really important. And yes, of course, some kids have trouble with, or they aren't as effective in person social interrelationships. And so you emphasize those, but we should use some of the others. And we can do things remotely in ways that connect us. And I've been talking with colleagues and friends, and they now stay connected with family members that are in other countries in a way they weren't able to do before the pandemic, because now people are home and you can actually do that. Over the winter holidays, we for Christmas we actually contacted family members and we did something over Zoom, and I saw people that I hadn't been able to see for several years. So I, I'm not saying it's better to do it virtually, but it can meet some of the needs for social interaction and connection. You can also, I was just talking with a family. They have a child with who has special needs and was getting tutoring from a high school student. She can't come over because of the pandemic. So we said, we'll set something up remotely. That way they can go on Zoom, let's say, and do some tutoring, and that gives the parents some time to do something else. Where they're not feeling the same need to occupy their child, and they're getting some help at the same time. So those are all some good ideas.
So there's an interesting question in here actually around having children who present different priorities. So someone writes that I have a 13-year-old child that stays up late, but gets up, does all their schoolwork, passes her classes, but stays in their room a lot and wants to go to their grandparents' house. Then on the other hand, I have another child who doesn't want to do anything, fights going to sleep, taking a bath, jumping all over the place, and always takes time for him to stop. Any thoughts on how to address having two children who present different prioritizations and different things?
Well, if you have two children, you have at least two different ways of dealing with things. I actually think some children, at some times they do it one way, and at sometimes they do it another way. So yes, the more kids you have, the more differences you'll have, and that is always a challenge. And I think first off, you have to recognize children have different personalities, they have different needs, and we just have to not always. I think sometimes parents assume they caused it. There must be something I did wrong that they do, whatever it is. And sometimes they are just different because they're different people. So I think what you do is you work with each child to try and figure out what is causing problems, and you work with that child on how to do better in that area. If a 13-year-old stays up late but gets everything done and isn't tired and finishes their work and is doing not just passing classes, but doing as well as they were doing before, then maybe it isn't a problem if their bedtime is a little bit later. Um, but there might be another child who is very sensitive to and needs more sleep. And then that child needs to get more sleep. I remember when my kids were growing up at home. Um, Actually, both of my children need a lot of sleep. That's just the way they were born. Um, they're adults now. They still sleep a lot, as far as I'm concerned. I don't need that much sleep, but they need a lot of sleep. And I remember at one point, my daughter came home after sleeping over at a friend's house. She was a teenager, I think, at the time, or maybe a preteen, and she was just really, difficult, crabby. And I just said, what's going on? And she looked at me, she goes, I didn't sleep all night. I need my sleep. And so I was like, well, then you need your sleep. And then I just help her understand that she needs that sleep or she doesn't feel well. And about a year later, I heard her, she was on a phone with a friend, and she said, oh, I'd really love to go over and sleep over at your house, but I'm not allowed to have sleepovers or go to sleepovers. So maybe I can come and my parents will pick me up when it's time to go to sleep. And I'm like standing there going, go to the sleepover. Like, this was going to be a night that my wife and I would be alone, we could go out to dinner. And I was like, just go, go. And she said no. And she got off the phone and I said, what was that about? And she said, you pointed out I need a good night's sleep. And I just said, but you can go. And she said, no, you're right. I do need a good night's sleep. And then I just said, but why are you blaming me? And she said, because it's embarrassing to tell my friends. And I said, but I'm the cool dad. I want your friends to like me. And she looked at me and she goes, Dad, they like you, but it's really more important my friends like me. So you can take the blame. And she was right. I'm like, okay, I'll pick you up before it's time to go to sleep. So I think you help kids learn what they need. And now that we're spending a lot of time with kids, as long as you don't lecture to them or make them feel badly, it's a good time to learn more about yourself and each other.
Thank you so much for everything today, Dr. Schoenfeld. And we're looking forward for you coming back next week. Not next week, sorry, next month, for part 3 of our social emotional learning. Before everyone goes, I want to thank everyone else for joining and for being a part and of making sure that this series continues and is successful. Um, do me a huge favor, everyone who attended. If you all can take a couple of minutes to take our event survey, I'm dropping that link in the chat right now. You'll also get an email tomorrow with the link to that survey. Please fill it out. It really helps us plan for these sessions and be able to provide you all with the topics that you all need at home. So we really, really appreciate it. Also, when you get that email tomorrow, it'll have the link to register for the next session, which will not be next week. We're taking a break next week because of the because schools are closed next week, but it will be back the following week. Um, Take that email with that link, share it with some friends who you think would benefit, because next session we're going to be back with Dr. Wexler talking about executive functionings for our part 2 of the 5-part series. So thank you again, Dr. Schoenfeld. Thank you everyone for coming online and being a part of this. And please take the survey. And until next time, stay safe, everyone.